So, do you think that this block of protest votes, because we did see this in other states too, do you think this is going to impact him enough where he will change his policy when it comes to Israel, when it comes to the war there in the next 8 months?
He's already trying to, in effect, play on the one hand, on the other hand, call it hot and sour soup policy. Uh, he behind the scenes, they're giving a lot of weapons to Israel, but Biden's two-state policy is really about the two states of Minnesota and Michigan, not about Israel and the Palestinians. And I think that the issue of the Israelis going into Rafah, which is this city on the very southern border with Egypt, is not something that any Israeli politician can give up to the Americans on. Now, the Israelis do have the issue of wanting to get the hostages back. But let me say something about why Rafah is a problem for the Americans and why the Israelis still want to do it. It's a problem for the Americans because there are so many civilians now crowded into Rafah, maybe 1.5 million, estimates vary. But because it's on the border with Egypt, there are a lot of tunnels that go from this Palestinian territory into Egypt. In the first year or two that the current regime in Egypt, the al-Sisi military regime, was in power, they tried to cut off transit through those tunnels, but they've stopped doing that. They may be starting to do it again because of Israeli pressure, but let me tell you why that matters to Israel. Arms from Iran can come in through those tunnels, and Hamas leaders can escape through those tunnels. Now, if arms come in, that poses two kinds of threats to what the Israelis are trying to do. One, of course, the obvious one, is that they can use those arms to attack Israeli cities in the south, which is what started the war in the first place. The other, which is less obvious, is that if Hamas is well armed, they can prevent anybody else from effectively ruling in Gaza. And that is just a no-go for the Israelis because otherwise the war just continues forever. You've got to have somebody who can step in and rule the area. And that's not an easy problem. Mind you, and this has been forgotten by Americans, the Americans gave the Israelis advice about Gaza once before. And that was during the George W. Bush administration when Mahmoud Abbas was elected in the West Bank as the head of Palestinian Authority. And the Americans, led by Condoleezza Rice, who I have a lot of respect for, but in this case, she strongly urged the Israelis, against their better judgment, to permit a vote in Gaza. That vote was held, and just as knowledgeable people predicted, the vote was for Hamas, not for the Palestinian Authority, in part because the Palestinian Authority was believed to be kind of old and corrupt, whereas Hamas was sort of younger and more vigorous. But of course, there's been no election in either area since then. But it was the Americans who did a lot to put Hamas, in effect, in power in Gaza. And remember, under Sharon, the very right-wing leader in Israel many years ago, all Israelis withdrew from Gaza. Some didn't want to. The settlers who were there were forcibly removed. But that area was completely given over to Hamas. They've controlled it since whatever it is, 2006, 2008, and you can see what they've done. So the Israelis feel like they have to root out Hamas. That's the goal of the war. They have to break that organization. And the Americans, if they were to be listened to, wouldn't allow them to do that.